Today we're going to talk with Dr. Cassandra Vieten, a scientist here at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, about emerging worldviews in our program, both historically as well as what we're doing today in terms of emerging worldviews, and then finally to talk about what are our next steps and where are we going.
Very, very happy to be here. And I don't know, I would maybe kick it off by saying that I've been here 7 years now, and I feel like I have an emerging understanding of emerging worldviews. And so what is the program area of emerging worldviews? Like, what is it that started that as one of the primary research areas, and maybe even what is worldview?
We can think historically about how the explorers of ancient history went out and continuously found broader worlds, bigger worlds, more expanded models of reality. And I think about the role that map making and cartography played in thinking about worldview and how we represented worldview. So one of the stories that I love to think about is Fra Mauro. And Fra Mauro, during the time of the Renaissance, was a famous cartographer. The interesting thing about Fra Mauro is that he was a monk and he never left the monastery. And so he was charged by the King of Portugal with developing the definitive map of reality and of the world. And so he had to sit in his monastery and wait for the various explorers to sail in and then impart to him their experiences of what the world was like out there. And so he then built this beautiful map that's imbued with all these magnificent golds and shimmering kind of essences. And the interesting thing for Fra Mauro is that what he had expected the explorers to describe for him was the physical lay of the land. But what these explorers came back with were these sort of enchanted realms of subtle energies and experiences. And so he had to find a way of representing both the physicality of what these explorers were mapping, as well as the kind of meta-physicality of what they were describing in terms of what is the nature of the world. And so his map becomes a kind of template for both what was the ontology, or the model of reality, the dominant worldview of the time, then flavored with something that I think surprised him, which was all of this kind of metaphysical dimensionality to it. What we've seen in the case of science and the history of science is that worldviews change, and in some ways we think about science as this absolute model of reality, and yet what we see over history is all the various ways in which, our model, our paradigm, our worldview has changed. And so I think that when we want to explore some of the questions today about societal change and the nature of complexity in these emerging times, this notion of worldview becomes very fundamental. And our ability to be flexible within the context of a changing worldview is part of that.
That brings to mind, when you say that, for me, is a couple of stories having to do with the filter that we all hold when we're looking at reality, and how that determines what the prevailing worldview is sort of our shared filters. And one of the stories is taking an anthropology class and learning about cross-cultural anthropology, in which people were exploring different cultures and looking at cave drawings. And there was an anthropologist that found a matrilineal society of drumming women. And these were very powerful rituals that women participated in, where they drummed, sort of like the Aboriginals have their song lines into reality, they drummed into reality, and this is what the feminist worldview is around this historical thing. But coming from the worldview of the early 50s, the male anthropologists that were looking at the cave drawings saw women with their drums, and they were large round drums, and their hands were like this, and the caption underneath the cave drawing in the anthropology textbook said, "Woman with cake." Right, because it's women bake cakes. I mean, so this must have been the first cake baking Betty Crocker society. And so the filter of that was interesting. And then the other story that comes to mind is a story that came from David Sloan Wilson, who's the colleague who works on worldview in the where religion and science meet. And he became familiar with some of Darwin's personal journals, where Darwin was exploring looking for fossils with Sedgwick, who was one of his original mentors and one of the founders of geology, who was also a very devout Christian. And so as Darwin and Sedgwick were looking through this valley for fossils, they were looking at these giant geological formations that in their mind were caused by the Great Flood, because that was a fact. The Great Flood was an absolute fact, and so they're looking for fossils, and they're saying, how interesting that some of these mountains have these slash marks and diagonals, and I wonder what part of the flood caused that. Now Darwin says it very eloquently, and I may not be able to say it word for word, but he said, seeing a burning house couldn't have told a story better of what happened there than these cliffs told in terms of glacier theory. But glacier theory hadn't been invented yet. Nobody thought that glaciers had moved their way through these valleys and carved these rocks. So without knowing about glacier theory, they were unable to even perceive the evidence that was in front of them, and they were fitting it into their a priori worldview. And so I think the question for us is partly, you know, as you say, there's the beauty in the worldview, however inaccurate, that was portrayed in the 14th century or the 13th century. There's much beauty in that, however inaccurate it might be. And so what are our own inaccuracies now, and what kind of beauty is in our worldview that might be maintained into our future as we become less filtered, and maybe see more of what's really here.